On the 2020 census, there is a proposed inclusion of a question about citizenship. The Census Bureau's own statisticians have predicted that including the question will depress turnout by 2.2%, which might not sound like much, but 2% of the U.S. population is the population of Massachusetts.
Welcome to Old South Meeting House and to this evening's conversation, Democracy is Hard, Voting Shouldn't Be. This is the final program in our four-part series with the ACLU of Massachusetts. My name is Erica Lindemood, and I am the Education Director here at Old South Meeting House. On behalf of both the Meeting House and the ACLU, I'd like to extend thanks to members of both organizations for your ongoing support of our work. And also, I'd like to thank the Lowell Institute, whose support allows Old South Meeting House to offer public programs free of charge throughout the year, this one and many others. The relationship between Old South Meeting House and the ACLU of Massachusetts goes back almost a century to the 1920s, when the ACLU was newly formed and the term banned in Boston was coined in response to repressive measures by the Watch and Ward Society and local government. During the 1920s, the Old South Meeting House Board of Directors debated the question of whether and how much to limit free speech within these walls, ultimately deciding in favor of the liberal policy for public gatherings that still stands today.
Thank you, Erica, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be here to engage in this very meaningful and important conversation about the role of voting in our democracy. I have the pleasure of having two colleagues with me, Cheryl Crawford, who's the Executive Director of MassVote, and Beth Huang, who is the Executive Director of the MassVoter Table, both very tireless advocates in the arena of civic engagement and voting rights, and I'm looking forward to their presentations. But before I have them introduce themselves, I'd like to say a few words about why this topic this evening for this series is so important for the ACLU. When we think about this representative democracy that we have and the experiment of democracy in this nation, one of the most fundamental rights, the preservative of all rights, is the right to vote, to exercise the franchise. And through this nation's history, there have been struggles and fights that have happened over this most important right. And we find ourselves several generations since the inception of this democracy still engaged in a struggle over this right to vote. There are so many people that we encounter on a daily basis who talk about the difficulties or the level of apathy that exists as it relates to being civically engaged and why people should cast their ballot or consider even participating in this process when the candidates that they are in favor of never seem to win, or the issues that impact their lives most directly don't have any relevance to the elections that get the most coverage. And so this notion of democracy being hard, trying to navigate the state house and get legislation introduced, or trying to push forward laws at the federal level that impact the very things that we are concerned and care about, can be disheartening and dissuade people from wanting to be involved in the democratic process. But and on a certain level, it's understandable why democracy can be difficult to access for people through the legislature or through policy reform. But one thing that should not be difficult is at a very base level, everybody being able to participate through casting a ballot. And there is a history that is replete with efforts of disenfranchisement and excluding people from the right to vote, separate and apart from the very narrow scope that was initially intended when voting was built into this democracy, that it was only for wealthy white landowning men. And over time, that franchise was expanded to incorporate and include more people through various voting rights acts and through the women's suffrage movement. And when we think about the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the expansion of the franchise to include historically excluded people, particularly Black people in America, there had not been a sustained effort of continuing to include people's rights to vote. But there had been a consistent effort to find more ways to exclude people, whether it was through redistricting, trying to draw districts in a way that exclude certain people, or voter purges. And so here we are in 2019, and some of the very things that we saw that led to the introduction of the Voting Rights Act of '65 are some of the very same things that we are fighting this day. And all along, the ACLU has been involved in advocating for reforms to our voting laws to make it easier and more accessible to people, engaged in litigation to challenge efforts at infringing on people's rights to vote. And here locally in Massachusetts, the ACLU has been involved, and thanks to partners like the Voter Table and MassVote, we've had some successes that both Beth and Cheryl can talk about in more detail through election modernization, or even some of the things that weren't successful but reframed the issue when we challenged the state's voter registration deadline or cutoff. It talks about the importance of voting. And so, having said that, we're going to have a wonderful conversation this evening about what both Beth and Cheryl are doing, their organizations are doing, and why it's relevant and important to continue to make voting as easy as possible for as many people as possible. So at this point, Cheryl, I'll turn it over to you. You can introduce yourself and talk about the work of MassVote.
Great. Thank you so much for having me this evening. Whenever we start these type of conversations, democracy is hard, voting should not be. I always have to ask the question, is voting a right or a privilege? It always stirs up a lot of conversation. But before we get into that, I'd like to share with you just a little bit about MassVote, who we are, about our role, and about some of our values. MassVote is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to advance voter participation in fair elections through its policy and legislative advocacy and our voter participation in education work. We are aimed to promote a culture of active political participation by providing individuals, grassroots groups, and organizations with training, resources, and technical support to foster year-long civic engagement campaigns, especially among historically disenfranchised groups in underserved communities. Across the state, we believe our role is to, one, ensure transparency, access and fairness in advancing through election legislation and processes. And I'll share with you in a moment some of the legislation that we've been working on and had success with, and some that we're currently working on. Our goal is to ensure everyone has an equal opportunity to participate, to vote, and to include their voice in the social, political future. Support, educate, and foster a culture of active political participation throughout the year. Our goal is to flip the pyramid of power. Make sure that Massachusetts residents are educated about the politics that affects their lives and how voting is one vehicle that helps to drive change. We hope that people get informed and educated about issues, the process, and the candidates, which makes it easier to participate. We want people activated. We want them to know that they are important, that their vote and their voice really does matter. I believe community organizers are the community guides that are prophetic messengers of hope, and our role is to win the hearts of all, the young, the old, the voter, the non-voter, because we can no longer justify this current political system that we are witnessing, the dysfunction and the toxicity, not just the dysfunction of the electoral, but the many systems, many movements that are emerging from Black Lives Matter, Dreamers, with DACA and the high school youth at Parkland, anti-guns and, indigenous movement on North Dakota pipeline. There's all these issues that boil up. Today, I believe that we must go deeper by extending our reach to those that we have relationships with and to deepening those relationships. A lot of our work over the years has been more transactional, really trying to make the point. We do the voter registrations, we do the form, candidate forms and things of that nature. And we track everything that we do just so that we can make sure that we are having the impact that we think we're having. But that's transactional. And what we find ourselves doing over and over again is reminding people that there's an election. And in Massachusetts, we already know there's an election every year. And we want to say people are apathetic. No, we have too many elections. And so we should start looking at some of the ways in which we can change that. Unfortunately, we need to keep the legacy of the civil rights movement alive as the ugliness emerges in different forms today. In 2006, the voting rights was extended for another 25 years, right? We have to keep extending as it is opposed to the law. And I had this conversation, why? Why are we not addressing that kind of situation? In Massachusetts, in November of 2010, a group called Show ID to Vote set up a table with a large Show ID to Vote sign inside of a polling location, right? And in New Bedford. And they looked at a lot like election officials and really, just putting fear in people's heart. Why? That is why our work is so important. There is still much more to do. This history is about controlling the state to control power and resources around housing justice, criminal justice reform, healthcare. The legacy is one of our exclusions. Our jobs is now to expand that. We do that by reducing the barriers to participation and increasing voter and civic engagement. MassVote is the living legacy of the Voting Rights Act, and we died fighting for civil, political, and economic power and rights. Part of our values is around educating. The work that we do is about educating people, helping them to understand what's at stake, why it's important that they engage. Quite often we hear people say that their vote doesn't count. And so constantly, and I always say to them, it absolutely does. Because if your vote didn't count, why would they work so hard to keep you from voting? So clearly it must count for something. We talk to people about participating on any level. Really, whether you're a citizen or not, you live here. Becoming civically engaged in the communities in which you live is critical, right? Having the face and of just being on the ground in these communities, dealing with folks that look like you really makes a difference. And then activate. Now, first we want to get you registered, then we want to encourage you to participate, but we really want to build people in such a way that they're now activated. They're not only doing this work for themselves, but they're doing it for their families, their friends, and their colleagues, and their communities, right? Really being active. There are many policies. MassVote works on 3 prongs. We have our fair agenda, in which we do election modernization in coalition with many my colleagues here and many others, but that's about, 2014 we passed online voter registration, early voting, pre-voting for pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. Last year we passed automatic voter registration. That one really still puzzles me. We passed it, we're working on implementing it, but when you say automatic voter registration, this is a watered down version, because if there are 2 requirements, one that you're a citizen and the other you're 18 years old, it seems to me like when you turn 18 years old, if you were born in America, you should be able to vote without registering. So this is a watered down version, but we're getting there. And right now, our baby that we're working on is Election Day registration, which really, I think it is the total stopgap. And then there's other ways that we can, and I'll wait on some when we start talking about other ways that we can implement changes and talk then. But your vote matters.
Great, thank you. And Cheryl, just maybe one or two questions before we turn to Beth, but one of the things that you mentioned, and I know what you mean when you say this, but for the benefit of those who might not understand, when you said there are too many elections, and that something needs to be done by that. Can you say a little more about what you mean when you say there are too many elections?
We do. Okay. So every year there's an election. And this year, unfortunately, it's the municipal election, which means the most. It means the most to me because these are the people that directly affect your quality of life. And in an election year where there is no mayor running, a municipal election, the turnout is low. Every 4 years, the mayor and the city councils run together. Then opposite that, on the even years, we have the state elections, right? Presidential election. Presidential election turns out the most people. But to me, it's not a great turnout. Even with the past two elections we had, one with Trump, one with Obama, both of them were exciting, but you liked them or you didn't. It didn't matter. I thought that people would turn out, and they did at 75% for presidential, but the municipal election, less than 20%, right? So every year there's an election, and there's a primary, there's a general, and sometimes we have special elections. I remember one year we had 5 elections in 1 year. Wow. Because we had it in March and April and in June, July, and it was just like ridiculous. It's too many. I think we need to consolidate them. We need to figure out a way that we can have give them longer terms and make it fewer elections, combine some of them. It might be a long ballot, but I think that would serve its purpose. People could appreciate that a little bit more if they only went to vote maybe every 3 years as opposed to every year.
And that's kind of in the spirit of making voting easier.
That's right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Right. All right. Well, Beth, I will turn it over to you.
Great.
You can introduce yourself and tell us what Voter Table is up to.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Beth Huang, and I'm the director of the Massachusetts Voter Table. We are a coalition of community organizations across our Commonwealth to increase civic engagement amongst communities of color, low-income people of all ages, and immigrants. And I'll be sharing a bit about what our strategy is to claim our power within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We think that there are 3 central pieces for building up representation, resources, and power for people of color, immigrants, and working people. The first is civic access, so that anyone who wants to vote can vote. And that's where these reforms like election day registration, like automatic voter registration, and early voting are so critically important. The second is civic engagement, so that anyone who can vote does vote. So this is related to voter turnout, this is related to showing up to your city council hearing. We want everyone who wants to participate to be able to participate in our democracy. The third piece is so critical. It's the basis and foundational assumptions that voters make. And it's civic representation, that if you and your neighbors vote, then your needs and your community's needs will indeed be represented in City Hall, at the State House, at the MBTA board, or really anywhere where they're making decisions that impact your daily lives. And we believe that there's a virtuous cycle between access, engagement, and representation to build a multiracial voting bloc and to develop leaders who have been pushed to the margins by our political and economic systems. So these are the barriers to our power, so to vote, you need to be 18 years old, a citizen, not incarcerated for a felony, and it depends on where you live. That means that our immigration system, our system of mass incarceration, and displacement and rising rents are the biggest threats to our democracy and the ability for people of color, working class people, and immigrants to be able to claim our power. And so we know that mass incarceration, low wage work, a lack of transparency in the State House, and siloed movements that on one hand someone is a renter, on one hand they're a parent, on another they might be a low-wage worker. When we organize these separate identities of the same person, we are missing the bigger picture. And so these are some of the barriers to our power, and to be able to claim our power, we need to organize around the issues that matter to people and build up our small d democratic institutions, whether they're community organizations, neighborhood associations, labor unions, or more. So this is historical turnout by race from 2010 to 2018, and what you'll notice is that the top line, the orange line, is turnout amongst white voters. White voters turn out consistently at a much higher rate in every election. And we also see that turnout for every group dips in midterm election years, which arguably have as much or more impact on people's lives. And we see that the decrease between the presidential years and the midterm years is greater for communities of color than it is for white voters. And that's really significant because when we think about the issues that I mentioned, whether it's mass incarceration, policing, immigration, and housing, so many of those decisions are made at the state level. And so we are ceding our power when we do not turn out for midterm elections and for municipal elections as well. So this is a graph of exactly what our gap is. So the top line is the maximum amount that people of color in Massachusetts could be represented. And the good news is it is indeed ticking up over time because there is a growth in the population of people of color in Massachusetts. Another really good piece of news is actually the share of registered voters is also increasing over time and tracks pretty closely with the total eligible number of voters of color in the state. Now here's the bad news. The vote share, the proportion of voters of color out of the total electorate, ebbs and flows with presidential elections. We start to claim our power in those presidential years, and then it drops off dramatically in midterm years. And we need to ensure that everyone, especially voters of color, understand exactly why midterm elections are relevant to their daily lives. We are still waiting on some American Community Survey census data to be able to calculate these numbers for 2018, and I anticipate that they will look somewhat similar to the numbers from 2014. So how do we close this gap in civic participation? So let's go back to our virtuous cycle of access, engagement, and representation to build this multiracial voting bloc and develop leaders. So at the Massachusetts voter table, we work with dozens of community organizations to train leaders to knock on doors in their own communities. And we see that when a neighbor when someone knocks on their neighbor's door, the increase on turnout is extremely significant. So, for example, for Latinx voters, in the 2018 election, Latinx voters voted at only 33%. So only 33% of registered Latinx voters actually turned out to the polls in November 2018 in what was considered a historic wave year for turnout. However, when someone from their own community knocked on their door, had a conversation with them, followed up with a phone call or a text message, Latinx voters voted at 62%. That is nearly doubling turnout by neighbors talking to neighbors, parents talking to other parents, and seniors talking to other seniors. This is the critical strategy for closing the civic participation gap is fostering community, especially to share why elections are why the issues and decisions that might flow from an election are so relevant to people's daily lives. And then by age, we see that the impact of someone who is part of an organization that you trust, whether it's the ACLU, MassVote, the Chelsea Collaborative, Neighbor to Neighbor, or any other set of organizations, we see that turnout increases, especially amongst young people, when someone who trusted contacts them. And I really want to give a shout out to some of the work that some of our partners and youth organizations do to mobilize young people, whether it's I Have a Future with young voters of color about criminal justice issues, whether it's MassPIRG on college campuses across our Commonwealth, or the Asian American Resource Workshop, which contacted hundreds of voters who are queer AAPI voters about question 3, about expanding civil rights for transgender people. These are people who don't vote at high rates, and when we have trusted messengers who share an important message that matters to voters, we see that the impact is really, really concrete, and voter contact is really effective in closing the civic participation gap. So how do we do this voter contact work? So first, we make it fun by bringing people together and training people up. On Halloween, at the Chelsea Collaborative, La Comunidad, and Revere Youth in Action brought together their youth programs. Everyone knocked hundreds of doors in one night along Broadway in Chelsea, Revere, and Everett. We talked to hundreds of voters because everyone was home on Halloween night. People dressed up, and the person who talked to the most voters got a selfie stick. So that's how we contact voters, we make it fun, and we're able to develop young people to talk to their neighbors. We also build analysis and take action on issues that matter. So this is a photo from a protest in December 2017 that tied the privatization of our public schools through charter schools to the Puerto Rican debt crisis. This happened 2 or 3 months after Hurricane Maria, and we had members of many different communities converge on the home of a hedge fund manager who owns a very significant amount of Puerto Rican debt, and so we build analysis and we build the pathway to ensure that people can take action. And then finally, we strengthen the very foundations of our democracy. The 2020 census is coming up very soon. The census is critical to determining the distribution of political representation and billions of dollars of federal public resources. We want to make sure that everyone gets their fair share of the public resources and political representation, and that's why we're bringing people together to make sure that there is a fair, accurate, and equitable census in 2020, leading to a fair redistricting process in 2021. Okay, and then we'd love to stay in touch about these really important issues impacting our democracy.
Thank you, thank you. So Beth, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the focus on communities of color, because there are some who would say, well, isn't it important that all communities vote? Why are there organizations that are specifically focusing on communities of color and increasing the vote and civic engagement within those communities?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So all over this country, and in particular in Massachusetts, there is a massive racial wealth and civic participation gap. I think many of us were shocked, but also simultaneously not surprised when we saw the Boston Federal Reserve's report that the average net wealth of a Black family in Massachusetts is $8. And that the average or the median wealth of a white family is, I think, $247,000, and that wealth gap also translates directly into a civic participation gap. When people feel that they have political agency, that they can build a home someplace, when they feel like their elected officials represent them. That creates that virtuous cycle that that I spoke to earlier, that makes people want to cast their vote, bring their kids, take some time off of work and more on election day because they feel genuinely proud and feel like they have some part of the common good of our Commonwealth. And then conversely, when people, especially people of color, are subjugated by low-wage work, mass incarceration, they have a cousin who is facing deportation, that strips people of their agency, and there are so many ways of subjugating people of color through many different systems of oppression. And so when we have neighbors talking to neighbors, or young people talking to other young people about voting, that builds people's sense of home and a sense of political agency. So that's why we focus on communities of color.
Great. And this is for both of you all, because there's this sense of dismissiveness, I think, when we talk about voter apathy, particularly in communities of color. And so maybe we can just spend a little time demystifying that and putting it in its proper place, to the extent that there is a lack of involvement in communities of color, and Beth, you've talked a little bit about this, but in addition to what those reasons are for the lack of engagement and interest, what are some of the additional barriers? And this is for both of you all to answer.
Some of the barriers, I believe, is just lack of knowledge. It's a very intimidating, the voting process can be very intimidating. You walk into a polling location, there's a police officer, you have folks in there that typically do not look like you. We're talking about communities of color that absolutely do not look like you, perhaps, or speak the same language. You know, English may be your second language. Mm-hmm. Not having those type of support, not having that type of support at the polling location in and of itself is intimidating. Just not knowing what are the issues. I think that, you know, it's about what they're involved in. When you're, you know, if you're a single parent, you have children, you don't have transportation, you have all these things going on election day. You can't get to the polls in a timely fashion, so we have people missing elections because they just simply cannot get there. So one of the things that we need to look at is figuring out, can we make it a holiday? Mm-hmm. Can it be on Saturday or Sunday? You know, we tried it with early voting, and I know the numbers. So the weekend we did, the first year we did early voting, that weekend, the numbers were sky high. I think 10,000 people voted just on that weekend. Just having the opportunity to go when you can. I think just knowing what are the issues and just understanding that the State House is your house. You vote for people to represent your interests. And then when they get there and they're not representing your interests for several different reasons because of the transparency that takes place in the State House, that's a whole nother conversation, you know. But I think a lot of it begins with education. Understanding the ballot questions are ridiculous. The red book that comes out, sorry, Secretary Galvin, the book that comes out, nobody can understand it. I do this for a living, and I have to read the thing over and over, the ballot question over and over. Can you imagine someone that's not that literate picking the ballot book up and trying to figure out, because oftentimes if you vote yes, it really means no, or if you vote no, that really means yes. You know, things of that nature, really having the opportunity to understand what are the clear issues. We know what's affecting our daily lives. We know when our children are not being treated fairly in school and they don't have a good education system. We know what it is when you don't have a job and you're working 2 or 3 jobs trying to keep food on the table and the roof over your head, that kind of thing. There's all of those type of barriers, and now you want me to help to understand what these issues are on paper, right? Understanding the roles. Quite often we spend time just helping people understand what are the different roles. It's city council election this year, not state rep, and they interchange both of those positions. So really, nobody knows what the clerk of deed does. right? We did a Forum 1 on the church. I'm just saying, right? And they affect our lives, and so oftentimes they don't vote down ballot because they don't understand. So lack of education is oftentimes.
Sure. Beth, you want to add to that?
Yes, to everything that Cheryl said. Probably the only thing I would add is I think voter turnout goes up when there are contested elections.
Right.
Right. That's why people often vote in the presidential election, because there is always a contested presidential election, and the sides are clear, or mostly clear to people, and they can have some broader assessment of how that might impact their lives. In Massachusetts, we have one of the lowest rates of contested elections at the local and state level. I think that stems from also still the feeling of disempowerment that lots of people feel, that if people from your community are not running for office, then you feel like your community is underrepresented or not represented at all, and then that further entrenches the feelings of disempowerment. And so I think that having contested elections, building the leadership development pipelines that empower people and give people a sense of agency to not only vote but also see themselves as decision makers is so critically important if we want a thriving democracy in Massachusetts.
Can I just back? Tail end of that is money in politics.
Of course,
right?
totally.
Like not being able to afford to run. It's ridiculous the amount of money it costs to run for office. And we run programs, we're incubating a program like the Pipeline that looks for grassroots women. That, these are the moms that go to the PTA meetings, they drive the kids to soccer practice, but they really have their ear close to the ground. They understand what the issues really are. And nobody's looking at them, because when we talk to people about running for office and things in appointed positions, they're looking at grass tops as opposed to grassroots. And I think, we're not looking at grassroots because they can't afford to run. And women, we have to ask them to run literally at least 7 times before they even think about running for office. They have to dot the I's, they have to cross the T's, they have to make sure the house is taken care of, the children are taken care of. And quite frankly, men don't have that same consideration. They wake up and say, I think I'm going to run, shake out their pants, and they keep going.
Yeah. And also when working people are being displaced in this housing crisis, it is hard to build new roots, right? To run for office, you need to have roots in the community. And so when people are being displaced from their communities because of eviction and foreclosure, that cuts off the pipeline, because people don't feel deeply rooted in the communities. And so while they might know all of the issues, right, and they might be able to speak to people's issues in their communities, if they're getting displaced from East Boston to Chelsea to Lynn to further out, we just will not see the kind of people who represent their communities be able to hold the elected positions to truly represent their communities in the halls of power.
I think those are all very significant barriers that exist, and they're societal issues that are kind of embedded that we all have to deal with. I do think that there are some structural issues as well that create barriers, and one of them is something that we litigated over, and that's the registration cutoff. This requirement that people register to vote 20 days before the election. And I think a lot of people will say, well, that's not that difficult if voting is that important. It's the most, preservative of all rights. And so you need to honor and cherish this right. So you should take the energy and commitment to make sure that you're registered 20 days in advance. But I think the reality is, and we saw this through our litigation, is that hundreds of thousands of people end up disenfranchised, meaning they would have otherwise been able to vote, but because they submitted their registration deadline after the cutoff, that they were technically ineligible to vote, even though the local municipality still processed the voter registration forms. And there's a reality that exists that sometimes people just don't start paying attention until right before. And if you've never voted before, or if your registration has lapsed because you haven't voted in a while, or if you've just moved here and then decide that you want to vote and this arbitrary 20-day deadline gets imposed, then that excludes a bunch of people that want to vote. What are you all, and you both kind of talked about the importance of expanding opportunities and so election day registration. How does election day registration address that structural disenfranchisement of voter registration deadlines?
Absolutely. It is the correction. I grew up in Wisconsin and was a campus activist when I was a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Because we had election day registration in the 2012 election in a majority student ward, we had 72% turnout. Wow. That is, the median age in that ward was probably 18 or 19 because it had most of the freshman dorms in it, and we had 72% turnout, which I think is which was the average turnout in Massachusetts in 2016.
Right.
So, I mean, election day registration is such a powerful tool, and I think it's so important, especially for primary elections. So in Boston, we have this September 1st rental cycle. The primary is often in September. In the municipal election this year, the preliminary election is on September 24th. 20 days before that is September 4th. So people have 3 days, wow. 4 days to register to vote. I know a lot of civically engaged activist young people, and I don't think that many of them are going to register in time. So it's absolutely a common sense, badly needed correction to allow people to express themselves and to cast their vote on election day.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's a win-win for everyone. It's cost effective. The initial costs are slight, but what it's going to do in the long run, everyone thinks it's going to be this rush. No one's going to register to vote, and the lines are going to be long. We took a team of folks to New Hampshire to witness it. It was smooth. You stand in one line, they have your name spelled wrong, or they can't find you, you just stand in another line, you show proof of residency, and then you go ahead and vote. It really makes people feel like they have engaged. Nobody, it'll cut down on provisional ballots, which I really don't think get counted, and either does anybody else.
And it's so disempowering.
Yes. You go over there and you fill out this, right, and we're going to put this in this pile, and if we have to have a runoff, we'll count it. Because they make the decision that night. But election day registration, for many reasons, as you started mentioning, there are many reasons why people miss the voter registration deadline. Just many reasons, mostly from moving. I think mostly, and forgetting to register again. And we worked on, I think a piece of legislation was permanent registration. You register one time, you change your location, your post office address, or you change your driver's license. It should follow you, like the magazines follow you. You ever order magazines? You do not have to tell the magazine company that you moved. And those magazines mysteriously show up at your new place. So why can't our voter registration do the same thing?
What about the issue of fraud, or the concern around fraud, especially when it relates to election day registration? Because that's one of the main things that opponents of election day registration raise, that there'll be college students who don't live in the state but show up here for a year and vote, or the busloads of Mexicans being driven up here to steal the election, the 3 million stolen votes. What about that fraud concern?
First of all, fraud does not really exist, right? And they're talking about people fraudulently voting over and over again. We can't get them to vote one time, really. So are we going to get enough people to really vote over and over to sway an election? But really, there's who did something? Dun & Bradstreet did, the Washington Post and the Brennan Center talked about some documented cases of voter fraud. It really does not exist. Or I had a statistic here about where they did, they have voter fraud maybe 2 out of, I don't know, 400,000 elections, right? Like some astronomical number where it just doesn't exist. And I think that's fear-mongering. People want to put fear. No one's trying to steal an election. We're saying let people vote. I don't know if you experience different things around that, but it doesn't exist.
Yes, it doesn't exist. I think in my greatest tweet in my college years, I said, if we played a voter fraud drinking game, it would be very sobering. It doesn't happen.
Touche.
They actually said you have a better chance of being struck by lightning than voter fraud taking place.
Right, and to the extent that there are concerns around voter fraud, let's look at North Carolina, where there was a Republican who stole election, right, through absentee ballots. So there is fraud that is happening, but it's not the kind that is complained of, which is people stealing votes by showing up to be someone else.
Exactly.
That does not happen.
It actually happens the opposite way quite often. Someone running for office. Look what happened down in Georgia.
Right.
They're taking people off the rolls because their names are not spelled exactly. Right? And you don't have a way to mitigate that.
So the voter purges, that happen. And to that end, I don't know that we have that same level of issue here in Massachusetts, but one of the things that happens, unfortunately, here is if people are not active voters and they haven't responded to the local census, they are removed from the rolls. Is that the same thing as a voter purge?
Well, Massachusetts is the only state that does that. First of all, if you don't fill out the census, the local census, they make you inactive. Then they want to say, show, and you have to be careful in the language because we don't have voter ID laws here. We have proof of residency, and there is a difference in the two. So, no, doesn't exist.
Right. And so you mentioned voter identification. So the voter identification, the voter purges, some of the initiatives that have come mostly out of Republican majority states have been introduced. And there's I believe a Suffolk University professor, or maybe UMass Boston, Professor Aaron O'Brien, who did some research that looked at the states where the most regressive voter legislation was introduced, whether it was related to purges, the moving of polling locations, or voter ID laws. And they were districts or states where there was a significant population of Black or African American voters who turned out high during the first Obama election. And there was a correlation there. Now, certainly that doesn't necessarily equal causation, but it's informative at the very least. I want to pivot a little bit and get to this notion of representation, separate and apart from the people who end up in office and whether or not people feel compelled to vote for the people who are in office, but how you are represented based on the population and your representation in that population, the count of the population. Why is the census so important?
Well, I think it ties into exactly the right-wing attack on voting that you were just talking about with voter ID. So I think there has been a concerted right-wing effort to undermine our democracy and to undermine our democratic institutions, small d, democratic institutions. And part of their agenda is to shrink the electorate, because we know that when we expand the franchise, that the electorate becomes more diverse, whether that was 100 years ago by expanding the franchise to women, in 1965 with the first Voting Rights Act, with the Voting Rights Act language access provisions. We know that whenever we expand voting rights, that the electorate becomes more diverse, and the people who held power have to give up something. So On the 2020 census, there is a proposed inclusion of a question about citizenship. The Census Bureau's own statisticians have predicted that including the question will depress turnout by 2.2%, which might not sound like much, but 2% of the U.S. population is the population of Massachusetts. And we know that that is going to vastly disproportionately impact immigrants. And what's even more than that is the citizenship question data is the data that these people who want to shrink the electorate need to be able to draw the political lines in redistricting that's based off of the population of only eligible voters and not the full population. And that hugely undermines who counts in our democracy. That totally shrinks who counts, and we know that this is part of an attempt to consolidate power. And so the most important thing is for us to come together, unite against xenophobia, and stand up for a fair and equitable census.
We're doing a lot of work around that to make sure that we're bringing the right messages. Whether the citizenship question appears or not, you still need to engage. You still must be counted. So we've been honing the messages around that, what we're saying in those communities. MassVote's working on democracy hubs, looking in these gateway cities so that we can absolutely grow, starting now, that we can identify folks in those communities that we can work with that will be like anchors, that we can build around them so that folks in those communities will have a familiar face. It's critically important that they get counted, and we want to make sure that they do. There's a bunch of things going on with the census. They've reduced the amount of money they're going to spend on enumerators, so they're not going to provide money for people on the ground, and we know we're going to need it because they put it on the computer. It's now going to be digitalized. It's going to be on the computer. Well, how many people is that going to affect? Whether you have a computer or not, whether you're computer literate, whether you're in a space in rural America where there may not be internet. It's so many different barriers along with the census this year, so our work is cut out for us.
Yeah, and the census certainly matters. Cheryl, you and I had an opportunity in 2011 to work on redistricting, and the numbers, we were a part of a coalition called Drawing Democracy that took the 2010 census data and developed redistricting maps. And here's why it's important. We went around the state hearing from people in different communities about what the community is, what is a community of interest, how the boundaries should be drawn, because sometimes district lines for congressional districts or state senate districts or state rep districts cut across cities and towns. And so what are the parts of the cities and towns that are connected? And it makes sense to have them considered as a community of interest and a district. And in doing that, our coalition presented some maps to the the Joint Committee on Redistricting, and in addition to increasing the number of state representative districts that were majority-minority districts that increased the likelihood of a candidate of color, or increased the likelihood that communities of color could elect a candidate of their choice. We also created a majority-minority U.S. congressional district, and that's the 7th congressional district that now Representative Ayanna Pressley holds. And so it's something that happened in 2011 that was based off the 2010 census that we saw the fruits of in 2018. So, and there kind of brings us full circle to this point around representation, because we saw a huge increase in voter turnout when Congresswoman Pressley was elected into office, because it wasn't that she stole Capuano's vote. I mean, she certainly did take some of those people, but what she also did was expand the electorate base. So I want to stop right here and open it up to any questions from the audience, and if there's anything that we talked about, said, or that we didn't talk about or say that is a point of interest or curiosity for you.
Thank you all so much. This is so wonderful. I did want to ask you your thoughts about the fact, especially with the cutoff date that we were talking about, to discuss a little bit how Massachusetts may be different than other states because so many of our state electoral decisions are made during the primary.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. The primaries are critical in Massachusetts because that's when our elections are typically won, during the primary. Everybody wants, I tell people quite often, they say, oh, I didn't vote in the primary, I'm going to vote in the general. So, well, your candidate might not be on the ballot. If you don't vote in September, you're going to need to get them on the ballot. And we have, you know, and it brings me to ranked choice voting. Also, I like ranked choice voting because it really helps people, it gets people to realize that your vote really does count. All your choices, you get to rank everybody on the ballot. And right now, I think we have like around 13 people running at large in the city of Boston. You get to rank all of them, and then you get to vote for them. But what's critical is that you vote in September in the primaries. Our elections are won in the primary. This is a Democratic state, so they say. We're a blue state. I think we're more purple than we want to believe. But yeah, we're a blue state, and so we typically don't have candidates running in the general. So whoever wins in the primary actually is the winner.
Right, and so when those primary elections are hardly covered in local media.
That's right.
And if they are covered really late and often already past that 20-day period, then people who want to vote cannot actually vote. And compounded with the September 1st move-in date for so many people in Greater Boston, those September primary elections without election day registration and with the 20-day cutoff, that is a policy that structurally disenfranchises so many people who are so disproportionately renters, young people, and people of color.
Notwithstanding the fact that typically our primary election is the day after Labor Day. So we don't want to talk about that part.
Right, and and it's so important, right?
That's right.
The primary election on September 4th, 2018,
That's right.
We saw the election of the District Attorney Rachel Rollins, and we know that there were so many candidates running for the District Attorney race in Suffolk County, and that has such a profound impact on the lives of thousands of people, particularly people of color in Suffolk County.
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, maybe we can end by you talking about kind of what's on the horizon and why we continue to need this advocacy, because arguably we have automatic voter registration, we have early voting, we have pre-registration for young people, online registration. You know, we've worked in the Election Protection Coalition, and the things that are happening aren't some of the more egregious things that we've seen in other states. So, you know, what's on the horizon in the advocacy, and do we really need to keep doing this work, and if so, why?
Absolutely. We need to keep doing this work. One is job security. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But no, we need to keep doing the work because we're really doing this transition into that relational and building community with people. And that's why we need the grassroots organizations that we work with to continue doing this work. I'll mention here that on June 20th is our hearing for Election Day registration. We'd love to have as many people as possible come out and support it, do written testimony, or come out and testify in person, and just really help the legislators understand how critically important it is that we pass this, and we pass it relatively soon. But we do have to do this work because they don't have it yet. They haven't harnessed the power that is theirs to take yet. And so we're going to keep pounding away at it and keep helping them and keep, helping them understand what is truly at stake, not only for them, but for the generations to come. And that, we need to be present and on the scene.
And in addition to Election Day registration, we need to fight for every issue that impacts voting, whether that's housing and displacement, mass incarceration, immigration, and more. We need to fight against every system that strips agency away from people. We need to band together in the face of a very difficult political climate of fear and distrust, especially in immigrant communities, to ensure that there is an accurate and fair census in 2020. And finally, we need to come together to ensure that we are fairly represented in the decade to come in the next iteration of a drawing democracy, advocacy, and organizer-driven redistricting process.
Great. Well, I agree with everything that you all said, and I know that the ACLU will be right there, shoulder to shoulder with MassVote and the Mass Voter Table, and we look forward to doing this work. Is a question?
Can I
or?
ask a question?
Oh, of course.
So I was really, I was sort of struck by the early comment about that we have too many elections, and sort of one question that raised for me is just thinking about, we were talking about education, right? And just if we, sort of ideal scenario seems like it would be having elections that are spaced out more and then being able to put more time and energy into education in between those elections. And then I was just thinking about the emphasis on civics in in formal K-12 education now, and particularly in the Boston Public Schools. And I was wondering if your organizations are doing any collaborative work with the Boston Public Schools related to those issues.
We are. Mass Voters, we have a Young Civic Leaders program, high schools paid internship for high school students. We started the Civic Ambassadors program when we got pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. We started going into the public schools and setting up a table during the lunch hour, getting a ton of people registered. And what we realized when we were doing that, we're registering 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds that will not be able to vote until they're 18. What are we going to do to entertain them for the next year and a half, 2 years before they're ready to vote? And that is educate them. Educate them on how they can be involved right now in making decisions and making changes, right? Simply by talking to their family. Hyde Square Task Force, I think, had a great slogan, I can't vote, can you vote for me? That kind of thing. So yes, the work has to be done in the school system at a much younger age. People should not become adults and be intimidated by this process. If you bring them up through school, educating them and helping them to understand what is civic engagement, what is power, what is building power, what does it mean to be represented, right? That they'll grow up informed and ready to vote.
And we work with a lot of youth programs that get out in their communities and knock on doors to get adults in their communities to vote. We know that civic engagement is a habit, voting is a habit. That's why we are fighting for these reforms and also developing young leaders to be civically engaged and close the participation gap long term.
That's great. Well, thank you all.